November 4th, 2026, 3:47 local time. The Baltic Sea, approximately 118 nautical miles southwest of the Finnish port of Helsinki and 94 nautical miles northwest of Kaliningrad. The Russian exclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania, a piece of Russian sovereign territory surrounded entirely by NATO states, home to the Baltic Fleet headquarters, and one of the most heavily militarized patches of geography on Earth. The water temperature is 6 degrees Celsius. The sky is overcast at 400 feet. No stars, no moon. Wind from the northwest at 14 knots, generating a short, choppy swell of 1.2 meters that makes the Baltic's already complex acoustic environment worse than usual. The Baltic Sea is a shallow, enclosed basin. Average depth 55 meters, with significant areas of 20 to 30 meters. Stratified by layers of fresh water flowing in from rivers above and denser saltwater below, creating acoustic ducting channels that scatter sonar returns unpredictably and give submarines operating at correct depth an almost total acoustic cloak against surface ship hull-mounted sonar. This is the worst possible ocean in the world for anti-submarine warfare. Russian submarine commanders know this. They have been training in these waters since the Soviet era. A NATO Standing Maritime Group 1 task force, 4 ships operating under German tactical command, is holding a night transit corridor 40 nautical miles southwest of Gotland Island, conducting a freedom of navigation passage that is simultaneously a practical exercise in Baltic Sea collective defense. The formation consists of a German Type 124 Saxon-class frigate as task group leader, a U.S. Arleigh Burke Flight 2A guided missile destroyer as the primary Aegis air defense asset, a Norwegian HNOMS frigate contributing anti-submarine warfare capability, and a Dutch De Zeven Provinciën-class air defense frigate. 4 ships from 4 NATO nations, operating under a unified tactical command, in waters that the Russian military considers its operational backyard. The transit has been underway for 19 hours. It is scheduled to complete in another 8 hours when the formation exits through the Danish Straits. In the planning rooms of the Baltic Fleet headquarters in Kaliningrad, this transit has been watched from the moment it entered the Western Baltic. Not with alarm. NATO formations transit these waters regularly, but with the methodical attention of a military organization that has spent 70 years preparing for exactly this geography, this opponent, and this configuration of forces. Welcome. I'm your host at Navy Legends. Tonight we are doing something we have not done before on this channel. We are moving the scenario north, out of the Middle East and Pacific, and into the water that sits between NATO's eastern flank and Russian strategic depth. The Baltic is a different threat environment, different physics, different doctrine, different history, and a different kind of danger. Not the asymmetric harassment of IRGC fast boats or Houthi loitering munitions, but the concentrated, professional, doctrine-driven strike capability of a major power military that has spent decades planning for precisely this confrontation. This is a fictional simulation built from real platforms, real weapon systems, and real operational doctrine. The date is November 4th. Let's begin. The improved Kilo-class submarine, Project 636.3, NATO reporting name Kilo, is one of the most acoustically quiet conventional submarines ever produced. Its diesel-electric propulsion system, running on battery power at low speed, generates a radiated noise level that has earned it the nickname Black Hole among NATO anti-submarine warfare crews who have attempted to track it in exercises. At 3 knots on battery power in the acoustic shadow zone created by the Baltic's thermocline, a Project 636.3 is effectively invisible to surface ship sonar and ranges beyond 800 meters. The submarine that entered the Baltic through the Danish Straits on November 1st, 3 days before our timestamp, was not registered in NATO's routine Baltic Fleet Order of Battle tracking as a current threat. Baltic Fleet submarine activity had been assessed as focused on training operations in the eastern Baltic, well away from the NATO transit corridor. This assessment was based on signals intelligence collection and satellite imagery, updated 48 hours before the transit began. 48 hours is long enough for a submarine to move from its documented position to an ambush point in a sea the size of the Baltic. The submarine had been given its mission orders 6 days earlier. in a classified operational directive from Baltic Fleet Command that tasked it with a single objective: demonstrate, conclusively and irrefutably, that NATO surface formations operating in the Baltic Sea are not invulnerable. Not necessarily destroy. Demonstrate. The distinction matters. Russian operational planning in this scenario was calibrated to a specific escalation threshold. A threshold derived from months of internal analysis of Western political red lines. NATO. Article 5 trigger thresholds and the specific diplomatic conditions of November 2026, in which 3 NATO member states were simultaneously managing domestic political crises that had, in the assessment of Russian strategic planners, significantly reduced the alliance's internal cohesion and its political capacity for unified escalatory response. The mission was a strike, precisely bounded, damage serious enough to demonstrate capability and resolve, while remaining below the threshold that would trigger a unified NATO kinetic response against Russian territory. Russian planners called this calibrated coercion. At 3:47:00, the Project 636.3 submarine was holding position at 38 meters depth on a silt bank 4.2 nautical miles northeast of the NATO formation's projected track. Engines off, battery power only, hovering on planes. It had been in this position for 6 hours and 14 minutes. Stationary, silent, listening. Its fire control system had been tracking the NATO formation since 1:22, using passive sonar alone. Not active pinging, which would immediately reveal its position, but passive listening to the propulsion noise, pump harmonics, and hull flow noise of 4 large surface ships moving at 14 knots through a quiet sea. The acoustic picture was imperfect, but sufficient for a firing solution. The submarine's commanding officer reviewed his firing solution at 3:44. The geometry was within parameters. The target, the U.S. R. Lee Burke destroyer, selected as the primary aiming point because its Aegis system represented the greatest threat to the subsequent escape, was at a range of 6,800 meters, bearing 247 degrees, tracking northeast at 14 knots. At 3:47:00, he transmitted a single pre-formatted message burst to Baltic Fleet Command on an extremely low-frequency channel. 4 characters, indicating firing solution confirmed and requesting final authorization. Authorization arrived at 3:47:31. 31 seconds later, at 3:47:44, the submarine fired, not torpedoes, cruise missiles. The 3 M54 Kalibr, NATO reporting name SSN-27 Sizzler, is a subsonic sea-skimming cruise missile in its anti-ship variant, with a range of 300 to 400 kilometers and a 450-kilogram high-explosive warhead. In its terminal phase, beginning approximately 15 kilometers from the target, the Kalibr's warhead section separates from the sustainer body and accelerates to Mach 2.9, performing a steep pop-up maneuver before diving onto the target from above. The terminal phase gives the weapon an engagement geometry that is extremely difficult for close-in weapon systems to handle. The attack angle, coming from above rather than from the horizon, reduces the effectiveness of both phalanx and ram systems, which are optimized for horizon-crossing threats. 6 Kalibr missiles left the submarine's vertical launch tubes in the span of 22 seconds. Tubes 1 through 6, ripple fire sequence, each missile breaking the surface, activating its sustainer motor, and dropping to a sea-skimming altitude of 10 meters within 4 seconds of launch. The NATO formation's radar picture changed at 3:48:09, 25 seconds after first launch. The German task group leader's SMART-L long-range volume search radar, one of the most capable surface ship air defense radars in Europe, detected 6 low-altitude contacts simultaneously at a range of 28 nautical miles, bearing 054 degrees, altitude 10 meters, speed consistent with subsonic cruise missiles, closing at Mach 0.8. Vampir, 6 Ziele, Peilung 5,4, Entfernung 28 Seemeilen, einlaufende Marschflugkörper. 6 targets, bearing 054, range 28 nautical miles, inbound cruise missiles. The NATO formation had approximately 6 minutes and 40 seconds, before the missiles reached firing range of the outer defensive systems. The task group commander, aboard the German frigate, had to make an engagement allocation decision across 4 ships with 4 different national combat system architectures, communicating on a NATO Link 16 data network. The Aegis system on the US destroyer was the most capable single-ship engagement system in the formation, but the Dutch and German frigates both had evolved Sea Sparrow missile and SM-2 capability that needed to be coordinated rather than duplicating engagement assignments. The tactical picture was shared across Link 16 within 4 seconds of first detection. The Aegis weapon system on the US destroyer immediately began computing intercept solutions and presented them to the tactical action officer along with recommended firing assignments. SM-2, Block 3B for the outer engagement, 2 rounds per target, drawing from the destroyer's 48 available SM-2 rounds. Simultaneous ESSM engagement from the German and Dutch frigates on any targets that survived the SM-2 layer. The plan was sound. The challenge was coordination speed. In a purely national engagement, 1 ship, 1 chain of command, 1 tactical action officer. The time from threat detection to first missile away is approximately 8 to 12 seconds for a trained Aegis crew. In a multinational formation, coordinating engagement assignments across 4 ships with 4 national command authorities, operating under a task group commander whose own fire control system is not Aegis. The coordination overhead adds time. In this engagement, under these conditions, with a 6-minute 40-second window, the coordination overhead added 34 seconds before the first SM-2 left the US destroyer's VLS. 34 seconds sounds small. It reduced a 6-minute 40-second engagement window to 6 minutes and 6 seconds. At 3:49:03, the first SM-2, Block 3B, left VLS Cell 11 aboard the US destroyer, climbing vertically before its sustainer motor bent its trajectory northeast toward the computed intercept point on Kalibr Contact 1. Over the next 2 minutes and 41 seconds, the destroyer fired 10 SM-2 rounds against the 6 inbound contacts, 2 rounds per target on the 4 highest priority tracks, single rounds on the 2 lowest priority tracks to conserve inventory. The German frigate fired 4 ESSM rounds against the same tracks as backup, and the Dutch frigate fired 2 SM-2 rounds of its own on the outermost flanking contact. The intercept results were mixed in a way that the post-engagement analysis would study for years. Against 4 of the 6 Kalibr contacts, the SM-2 engagement was effective. 2 direct hits, 2 proximity detonations. All 4 missiles destroyed at ranges between 14 and 21 nautical miles from the formation. Clean, professional work from the destroyer's fire control team under pressure. Against the 5th Kalibr contact, the SM-2 achieved a proximity detonation at 11 nautical miles, close enough to damage the missile sustainer section and send it tumbling into the sea 8 nautical miles short of the formation. 5 of 6 calibers neutralized. The 6th Kalibr contact had done something the engagement model had not fully accounted for. At approximately 3:50:44, during the peak of the SM-2 engagement activity, when the Link 16 network was saturated with track updates and engagement status reports from 4 ships simultaneously, the 6th missile had executed a pre-programmed course change of 28 degrees to port, swinging from its original bearing and approaching the formation from a flanking angle that placed it in the radar shadow created by the German frigate's own superstructure relative to the US destroyer's Spy 1D antenna array. The shadow lasted 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, the 6th Kalibr was inside 8 nautical miles and still unengaged. The German frigate's own UPAR phased array radar, a shorter range but highly precise fire control system, reacquired the contact at 3:51:17 and immediately assigned 2 ESSM rounds. The first ESSM impacted at 4.9 nautical miles, a direct hit. The Kalibr sustainer section was destroyed, but at 4.9 nautical miles, the terminal phase had already begun. The warhead section, 450 kilograms of high explosive in a hardened separating body, had separated from the sustainer 12 seconds earlier at the 15-kilometer terminal initiation point and was now traveling independently at Mach 2.9 on its pop-up attack trajectory. The ESSM had killed the sustainer. The warhead was still flying. The separated warhead section has a radar cross-section of approximately 0.003 square meters, significantly smaller than the full missile. The German frigate's goalkeeper, CIWS, a 30mm Gatling system similar in function to the US Phalanx, acquired it at a range of 2,100 meters at 035129 and immediately engaged with a full burst of 550 rounds in 1.4 seconds. The burst achieved multiple hits on the warhead body. The warhead did not detonate. The fusing sequence requires deceleration sensing on terminal impact, not fragmentation damage. But the hits deflected the warhead's trajectory by approximately 14 degrees, causing it to strike the water 47 meters off the Norwegian frigate's port bow, rather than impacting the ship's hull. The detonation of a 450-kilogram warhead at 47 meters in shallow water produced a pressure wave that struck the Norwegian frigate's port hull at 351.31. The ship's hull was designed to withstand underwater blast to a survivability standard of 30 meters. At 47 meters, the pressure wave transferred to the hull plating without causing penetration, but created sufficient structural stress to shear 3 equipment mounting brackets in the machinery spaces, crack a transverse frame in the forward hull section, and drive a compression wave through the hull that threw every standing crew member off their feet simultaneously. 4 sailors broke bones in the fall. 1 petty officer suffered a traumatic brain injury when his head struck a console edge. The engineering officer of the watch dislocated his shoulder, catching himself on a ladder rail. No flooding, no fire, no loss of propulsion or combat systems, but the Norwegian frigate was damaged. It required port visit for structural survey before it could continue operations. A NATO warship had been taken out of the Baltic Sea task group by a 47-meter near miss from a Russian submarine-launched cruise missile, and the submarine was still out there. The anti-submarine prosecution began the moment the task group commander identified the launch bearing. At 3:48:14, 5 seconds after first contact on the inbound Kalibrs, he had already transmitted an emergency tasking to a German P-3C Orion maritime patrol aircraft that was on a routine surveillance orbit 110 miles to the southwest. The P-3C diverted at maximum speed. Simultaneously, the Norwegian frigate, before it was affected by the near miss, had deployed its towed array sonar at 034900, streaming the TB-29 equivalent system behind the ship at slow speed, on a leg that optimized acoustic coverage of the launch bearing. The towed array is a fundamentally different tool from hull-mounted sonar. It removes the ship's own propulsion noise from the acoustic picture, allowing the passive receive elements to hear at significantly greater distances and sensitivity. At 3:52:11, 4 minutes and 27 seconds after the missile launch, the Norwegian frigate's towed array painted a contact. Bearing 054 degrees, range estimated 4,800 meters, Doppler consistent with a slow-moving submerged contact at depth. Classification: probable submarine. The contact was immediately broadcast on the task group net. The US destroyer already had a torpedo in the air. A VLASROC fired at 03:52:04 based on the computed launch datum, the back-plotted origin point of the 6 Kalibr missiles, which the destroyer's fire control team had triangulated to a position accuracy of approximately 600 meters. The Mk-54 torpedo entered the water at 03:52:19 and began its search pattern, sweeping a spiral from the computed datum outward. The towed array contact gave the prosecution team a position that was 1,200 meters from the ASROC drop point. The Mark 54 was searching in the wrong place. At 3:53:40, the P-3C Orion arrived on scene at 5,000 feet and immediately deployed a pattern of 6 sonobuoys around the towed array contact position. By 3:55 and 12 seconds, 2 sonobuoys were reporting clear contact. A large submerged object at 36 meters depth, moving at 3 knots on a bearing of 031 degrees, showing propulsion noise consistent with a Project 6 36.3 on battery power. The prosecution geometry was now precise. The P-3C crew had a firing solution: authorization to attack a Russian submarine in international waters with lethal weapons required escalation authority above the task group commander. The request went to NATO's MARCOM, Maritime Command, at Northwood, England, at 3:55:44. The Sutsur, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, was awakened at his residence. The U.S. National Security Council Situation Room was notified at 3:56:02 Washington time, 9:56 local. The deliberation at Northwood lasted 7 minutes and 12 seconds. 7 minutes in which the Project 636.3 was maneuvering, accelerating, attempting to open range from the prosecution contact. 7 minutes in which the sonobuoy contact was drifting at the edge of reliable tracking as the submarine increased speed. 7 minutes in which the P-3C crew watched their solution degrade from precise to approximate. Authorization to prosecute with non-lethal measures only, specifically the deployment of a Mark 54 set to minimum yield exercise mode, which would produce sufficient pressure to force the submarine to surface without inflicting fatal hull damage. A tactic used once in Cold War practice and never since, was granted at 4:03:17. The P-3C dropped one Mark 54 in exercise mode at 4:03:44. The torpedo ran true and detonated 12 meters below the submarine's keel. The pressure pulse was not lethal. It was not designed to be, but it was sufficient. At 4:06:22, the Project 636.3 surfaced. Emergency surface. Ballast blown. Conning tower breaking the Baltic chop at 4:06:22. Crew appearing on the bridge within 40 seconds. A surfaced submarine in international waters is not surrendering. The commanding officer transmitted on Channel 16 at 04:07:01, reporting a propulsion casualty and requesting safe passage. The German task group commander acknowledged without offering assistance. He directed the U.S. destroyer to station 800 meters off the submarine's beam and transmitted the submarine's position to Baltic Fleet Kaliningrad on open maritime safety frequency, telling Kaliningrad without ambiguity, "We have your submarine. We know what it did. We are watching it." The submarine reached Russian claimed waters at 11:44, limping east at 6 knots on damaged diesel engines. 2 Russian Baltic Fleet surface vessels met it there. The diplomatic fallout was, by any normal measure, extraordinary, and by the standards of November 2026, entirely predictable. Russia issued a statement at 10 o'clock Moscow time characterizing the Mk-54 attack as an act of aggression, demanding an emergency UN Security Council session, and suspending all military-to-military deconfliction contacts with NATO. The hotlines created specifically to prevent accidental escalation in exactly this kind of incident were now offline, suspended by the party that had initiated the incident. NATO issued a collective statement at 1400 Brussels time. It documented the Kalibr launch, the Norwegian frigate damage, and noted that the non-lethal prosecution represented extraordinary restraint. It did not invoke Article 5. 3. NATO member governments expressed private concern that restraint would be read as weakness. 2. Expressed private relief that it had prevented decisions for which they were not politically prepared. This is the conversation that November 4th put on the table, and it is the conversation that sits at the heart of what Navy Legends exists to analyze. The Baltic Sea engagement worked out, in the narrow tactical sense. A submarine fired 6 cruise missiles. 5 were intercepted. 1 produced a near miss that damaged a frigate without sinking it. The submarine was found, prosecuted with non-lethal measures, and sent home. By every metric of tactical outcome, NATO performed competently. The defensive systems worked within their parameters. The anti-submarine prosecution was executed professionally, under significant time pressure and multinational coordination challenges. And yet, the Norwegian frigate needs structural repair. The deconfliction hotlines are offline. 3 governments are debating whether restraint is wisdom or weakness. And in Kaliningrad, the after-action reports from the operation are being studied by planners who are already calculating what a 12-missile salvo would look like, and whether the coalition coordination delays that added 34 seconds to the first SM-2 engagement might be exploited more aggressively next time. The Baltic Sea is 422,000 square kilometers. It has 9 NATO member state coastlines. It has a Russian exclave on its southern shore with shore-based Iskander missiles that can reach every capital in the region. It has acoustic conditions that give submarines a structural advantage over every surface ship that tries to find them. And it is going to keep demanding answers that our current doctrine and our current force structure are not completely prepared to give. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. I'll see you in the next one.